Okay, hi everybody, welcome. We're going to get started. I'm Dan Ho-Sang in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration and American Studies. It's just so nice to see such a full room. The guests that I'm about to introduce just spent an hour in a graduate seminar that I taught. And I just have to say, by way of thanks to the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, to have a center, units like American Studies, Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, that can just bring such committed collaborative scholars into like the presence and as a site of graduate education. I'm so, so grateful for. So I just want to thank Stephen Pitti, Matthew Tanico, Nicole Edwards, and RETM for sustaining spaces like this. I'm really, really grateful. It was just such a rich and generative discussion. I'll just, we have the next event in the series will be next Tuesday. It's going to be in the evening at 6 o'clock in WLH 309, and it'll be with Professor Christina Heatherton, who's a colleague of Manu's at Barnard College. She's going to be giving a wonderful talk about the artist Elizabeth Catlett and her emergence as a kind of site of Black feminist internationalism through her experiences and training in Mexico in particular. So that's next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. I'll just quickly introduce our speakers, then turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Lowe. And I'll also just mention this quickly because it connects to our panel. Tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, there's a plenary titled Imagining a Future of Public Abundance, which is really about how we reimagine our commitments to one another, what we imagine the state for ourselves to do after many decades of privatization, austerity. So it's at 6 o'clock at Dwight Hall from 6 to 7:30. I'm going to just pass this around. Great, thanks. So now we turn to our panel, and I'll just introduce them quickly and just say just one very quick thing about connections. Manu Karuka is an assistant professor of American Studies and affiliated with Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College. His work centers a critique of imperialism with a particular focus on anti-racism and indigenous decolonization, and he's the author of a truly wonderful and breathtaking book, Empires, Tracks, Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad, published by University of California Press. Jodi Byrd is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, an associate professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's also a faculty affiliate there at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Her work spans critical indigenous studies and governance, critical technology studies, indigenous feminisms and sexualities. She's the author of a deeply influential monograph, The Transitive Empire, Indigenous Critiques of Colonialism, and co-editor with Alyosha Goldstein, Jodi Byrd, and Chandan Reddy of an issue of social text titled Economies of Dispossession, Indigeneity, Race, and Capitalism. And Social Text, which is published here, hosted a conference about that. So I also just feel grateful that we're kind of back in relation for that project as well. And finally, Alyosha Goldstein, professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. Goldstein's the author of Poverty in Common, The Politics of Community Action During the American Century, and editor of Formations of United States Colonialism. And does work on globalization, neoliberalism, and social movements. I had an absolutely gorgeous slide of all of their books together, which we can imagine, which Lisa will enact. Thank you. That's why we do this together. And even in just putting this slide, it made me think about the relationships we can trace in this work. There's something just deeply important about the collective investment in shared intellectual goals. And we really saw it in this time in our graduate students in the seminar, where none of this work is possible to be done at an individual site of knowledge production. People are deeply, deeply reliant on the kinds of insights they're producing together. And I realized as they were talking that this is very much about the very remaking of knowledge. The intellectual organization of the university often reproduces and naturalizes all of the severances, dispossessions, and disturbed relationalities of capitalism and liberalism. So land from labor, racial domination from colonialism, et cetera. So this is work that very consciously interrogates the terms of those separations. It constantly transgresses, undermines, and refuses the conventions of liberalism, market economies. Everything becomes open for contestation and reimagination, ourselves included. I'll just turn now to introduce my colleague Lisa Lowe, who's moderating the panel. But I want to just say, when you read all these together, one through line you see is references to Professor Lowe's scholarship, and not just as a performative citation, but because Professor Lowe's work is doing particular things in all of their analysis and shared commitments. So it's an honor to be there with them and also to share this with you. And I'll introduce Lisa Lowe now.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. As Professor Hosang was saying, this is really an honor and a privilege to hear from these three scholars today who are very much thinking with one another, but also thinking with all of us. In my graduate seminar last semester, we read their work the semester before, and I think all of you appreciate what it means to have them here in discussion. So I'd like to start by just inviting each of them to speak generally about the way in which their work as individual scholars in their monographs, but also their collaborations and their practices as activists and intellectuals has placed the study of settler colonialism in relation to racial capitalism. And that might involve for each of them unpiecing a little bit what we understand those terms to mean and what it means particularly for them working in certain historical periods and on certain paradigms. So why don't we go in this order? Beginning with, do you want to begin with Manu?
Sure.
Okay.
Great, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, sitting with some of my favorite intellectuals, not only in the front of the room, but throughout the entire room. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? All right. So let me just begin. So I think to just go off of something that you put on the table, it's the work to think through these concepts and think across what are maybe useful but also arbitrary divisions or divides, and there are gaps. So I work in archives, so there are gaps in the work that's produced that are actually not necessarily there in the archive. So for example, in the book, in Empire's Tracks, there's a dialogue between railroad corporate officials and military officials. They're talking back and forth about resources and a shared common effort in building a railroad and occupying indigenous lands. And there are distinct subfields of U.S. history. There's U.S. corporate history and there's U.S. military history that have read one part of this dialogue. And so when you're in the archive, you see the letters back and forth, and yet the histories have been written only using one side, one part of that dialogue, right? So that's just one specific example of those arbitrary, maybe sometimes useful distinctions that I think we're all trying to think against and push against. So to take up the terms settler colonialism and racial capitalism, for me, I wrestle with these terms as terms that give us access to specificity and precision, which are useful, I think, but also as terms that can push into exceptionalism, which is not so useful. So wanting to push against those exceptionalist dimensions of the thought. So just some brief thoughts that come to mind with defining what's specific about settler colonialism, what's specific about racial capitalism. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines colonialism as colonization by settlement, which if we're going to take colonization by settlement to be colonialism, then it raises a question about what's distinct about settler colonialism. It almost raises a certain circularity about it. I'm not a philologist, so we don't need to be bound to definitions. But then there are other ways that the field gets proposed, that the field announces itself. The work on settler colonialism, is it work about Anglophone settler colonies? Is it work about the British Empire, the Commonwealth plus the United States? So for example, the history Replenishing the Earth by James Belich is a work about settler colonialism and Anglophone settler colonies, leaving out Ireland, which to me is interesting, an interesting relation. But, so if we forget that historical precedent or fact, Anglophone settler colonies, is this what settler colonialism is? Robin D.G. Kelly has pointed out in an engagement with Traces of History, Patrick Wolf's last book, that the field in many ways leaves out Africa, the continent, and different sites by different empires. We can think of Algeria, we can think, of course, of South Africa, we can think of Kenya. And, it leaves out not only these histories, the space, the geography of Africa, it also leaves out the political truth, the political, seemingly important fact that these are sites in some places where settler colonialism failed or where settler colonialism was defeated. And then, for us living, let's say, in North America, what lessons can be drawn from the defeat of settler colonialism in Southern Africa? So the field, proposes and defines itself in certain ways that leave potentially very important questions off the table for us. Racial capitalism is a term that I use that's really central to my thinking. But there's certain challenges that arise with racial capitalism. The term itself, I think, is it reminds us all that capitalism always has proceeded on a racial basis. And yet we know, especially as big foundations give big money to study of racial capitalism, it's almost as if there's an idea that there's a kind of racial capitalism, but there's another kind of capitalism. That racial capitalism is a particular kind of capitalism. There's another kind of capitalism we could imagine that's not racial capitalism. But to go back to the original point of racial capitalism is just the fact that all capitalism has proceeded on a racial basis or through racial differentiation, then what distinguishes racial capitalism from capitalism analytically, as we use the term? So there's a kind of redundancy in the term, similar to settler colonialism, colonization by settlement, the accumulation of capital through racial differentiation. Another challenge for me with racial capitalism at this point in the conversation is taking race as a point of origin for the analysis, whether we're talking about historical point of origin or a theoretical or structural point of origin. Race as assumed as an explanation or a cause, rather than race as what is produced or race as what needs to be explained. So in Black Marxism, race appears in quotation marks in Cedric Robinson's writing there and elsewhere. This is something that, in the work of Ruthie Gilmore, I find a great and very productive challenge. The insistence that we need to always remember that race is what we need to explain. Race is a fiction with very real concrete effects, but we need to explain race. We don't need to proceed from an understanding that race gives us the answer. Stuart Hall, of course, has produced another body of work that helps us to think through these questions. And in our moment, there's a way I sense it feels that in many ways we are on the anti-racist side. We've actually slipped into rebiologizing race through ancestry, through inheritance, taking race as a biological category, not like the crazy eugenicists, but it's almost slipped into the conversation, slipped into the analysis, rather than taking race as a feature of political economy, which I think is actually the lesson I take from the idea of racial capitalism. So stop me if I'm going on too long. I can talk for a long time, but so thinking about settler colonialism and racial capitalism together for me brings me to think about imperialism as a category. Imperialism, to think about how race is produced, to think about distinct modes of colonialism that are in relation, productive and otherwise, with each other, and to think about questions of defeat and pushing and winning victories. So one way, imperialism for me is a conjunctural category. It's always, it exists in different ways in different moments. So even to think about the term settler colonialism and racial capitalism, I'm increasingly learning to think conjuncturally about these terms. So for example, when we talk about settler colonialism, many people cite Patrick Wolf and some core formulations and core pieces that he wrote. He was writing and thinking about questions in a very specific historical moment and political moment in Australia. So it's a question for us as his readers. What was his moment? What was on the table politically that led him to ask these questions and to arrive at these provisional answers through this idea of settler colonialism? Another through line we could look to is Haunen K. Trask, again, with the idea of settler colonialism in a different place, in a different time in Hawaii. What was it that was happening in that place and time that led her to propose these ways of thinking about settler colonialism? And with racial capitalism, of course, we could think about Cedric Robinson. As he was working through the ideas of Black Marxism, the core concepts, what was happening and what was he responding to in his political moment? And then, in our own moment, what connects our moment to those specific places and times as we engage those ideas, as we cite those works? What is resonant in our moment? What political questions are on the table that we need to answer that they were grappling with? And what is different, I think those are actually, it feels to me, important sets of questions to answer in thinking about the relationship between these terms. So there are two people I want to kind of briefly, hopefully briefly and not too long, but kind of engage in their work that's been providing me answers or keys to think through these questions. One is Ejaz Ahmad and the other is Gerald Horne. And I've been working and thinking a lot with this, to me, an incredible essay by Ejaz Ahmad called Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Imperialism of Our Times, which was written after 9/11, was written after the U.S. Criminal invasion of Iraq. And in this essay, he's assessing what is the unique shape and nature of imperialism in that moment of the George W. Bush administration in the United States after the U.S. had launched this invasion, and what had changed, and what were the historical models to draw upon in earlier times. And Ahmad, he proposes this idea of something he calls imperial sovereignty, which he's developed in later essays and interviews, drawing on the authorization for the Minimum Use of Force Act that U.S. Congress passed in the days after, I think unanimously, in the days after 9/11. And so with this idea of imperial sovereignty, as I read this essay and I'm thinking about our own moment and what's on the table politically now, it raises these questions. What do these ideas of settler colonialism and racial capitalism help us understand about our moment and about imperial sovereignty in this moment? So I want to just briefly talk about some of these points that Ahmad is trying to track out. So he's tracking out, in the early years of a war on terror, a doctrine of limited sovereignty that he says is emerging as a major component in U.S. policy, with vast implications for what he calls a new imperial constitutionalism. And this is applied not only to third world countries, but even selectively to Europe's abilities to pass laws for itself. So, for example, if you remember, there was a rendition of someone from the streets of Genoa in Italy, who was just taken by U.S. intelligence forces and then rendered to some black site. So even in European territory, it raises these questions about what is a sovereign control of these countries. The U.S., Ahmad writes, claims a sovereign right to act in its own interests, which it calls defense, while flouting the sovereignty of others, so that the sovereignty of the imperial state seems boundless. So this is one aspect of what he's calling imperial sovereignty. What we're witnessing, he writes, is the making of an imperial sovereignty claimed for itself by a state which is at once the state of a nation as well as a globalized state of contemporary capitalism. So there's something distinct about the nature of capitalism at this time. The U.S. arrogates to itself a limitless sovereignty, which is arbitrary by nature and can only exist insofar as its might is so superior to that of all others that its action would necessarily go unchallenged by other components of the global state system, however resentful they might be otherwise. So European Union, IMF, WTO, World Bank, the U.S. is willing, the International Court, willing to go against these in its own interests. This globalized and punctual policy of military interventions has mystified those on the left for whom contemporary capitalism is a system essentially of transactions among the advanced countries and for whom the third world is largely irrelevant due to the meagerness of its share in world production and trade. However, Ahmad continues, even as a third-rate general would know, it's on the flanks that the center is secured. No flanks, no center. So the U.S. has always sought to hegemonize the whole of the tricontinental imperial realm in Asia, Africa, and Latin America so as to monopolize its vast strategic resources and thwart its revolutionary potentials in a permanent counter-revolution, consolidate its dominant position within the one of advanced capitalism itself. So here I think that long quote, hopefully I didn't read it too fast, but I think there's a bridge to indigenous studies here. This concept of imperial sovereignty raises the question of what exactly is U.S. sovereignty, let's say over what the U.S. calls its homeland. In Empire's Tracks, I try to think through this through a concept of counter-sovereignty, that the U.S. declares its sovereignty always in reaction to collective life that exists. Ahmad continues with some, to me, really interesting, this is, after the invasion of Iraq, really interesting notes and insights on settler colonialism itself. So this is the reason why I want to set this up with his essay. He writes, there's a sharp contrast between different kinds of colonialism, as for example, between settler colonialism, which succeeded in the Americas and Australia but failed in Africa, and the so-called colonies which were occupied, administered, and exploited by bourgeoisies so external to them that they never put down their roots in conquered lands. Some of the white settlements in the temperate zones made a transition to advanced capitalism, notably North America, and to an extent Australia and New Zealand, but others did not, he writes, as in South America. None of the occupied but unsettled colonies did, not even India, which had fairly advanced levels of mercantile capital, as well as sophisticated pre-industrial manufacturers at the moment of colonization. And this would stand for China as well as for the major African empires, Songa, Congo, Ashanti. Ahmad continues, much capital and technology was transferred to the settler colonies, but very little to the unsettled ones. So there's something about the nature of capital and development that settler colonialism distinguishes, right, between other forms of colonialism. And he ends, the settler colonies which made the capitalist transition are marked by the dominance of industry over agriculture, and they have a demographic balance in which the employed greatly outnumber the unemployed. In those which did not make that transition, the unemployed and indifferently employed tend to exceed the employed sections of the working class. So I think there's a lot that's really concrete, telling us about region, the relationship of the countryside to the city, the relationship of agricultural labor to industrial labor, the relationship of employed to the unemployed. There's a lot that he's actually drawing out from this distinction of settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism that we could say are not settler colonialism. So I think there's a lot of value if we want to be precise. What is settler colonialism? What's its relationship to capitalism? And how does this help us understand the nature of imperialism in different historical moments? The other person I want to just draw up briefly is Gerald Horne, who's been thinking about and proposing that we think about settler colonialism as a form of class collaboration. And one way I think this is, for me, really productive is that it moves our attention away from, it routes our attention away from a divide between settlers and natives, which is, it's a divide where we're focused a lot on discussing the distinctions between these identities. It draws our attention away from that, which maybe we could link to the assumption of race as a point of origin. And instead, it moves us into a focus on land. It moves us to a focus on labor. So Horne argues that settler colonialism is a form of class collaboration by offering the possibility of free land, or by offering the possibility of owning labor, by offering the possibility of being a slave owner, or an industrialist, or plantation owner. So he's pointing to an alliance between a yeoman farmer, a plantation owner, and an industrial capitalist. And we can map out a history of finance in this class alliance that ultimately, removes the planter, the plantocracy, from this equation. It settles on the balance between a yeoman farmer and industrialist. There's a link here, I think, to Du Bois, not only in Black Reconstruction, where he's mapping out the end of that triadic relationship, but also in his essay, The African Roots of War, which is explaining an analysis of imperialism. In The African Roots of War, Du Bois has this concept of the dividends of whiteness. So I think there's a connection here maybe with the dividends of whiteness and this idea of settler colonialism as class collaboration. Dividends is different than the wages of whiteness, which is the familiar term from Black Reconstruction. Think about the difference between wages, which is what a worker which is what a capitalist gives to a worker for exploiting them, and dividends, which is what an investor receives, for their investment. So settler colonialism, in Horne's analysis, diffuses class struggle. Settler colonialism can give us one answer to the question of why hasn't there been a socialist party, a socialist movement that's captured state power in the United States. And one thing I think both Ahmad and Horne can help us do is move from a focus on ontology or a focus on race as the beginning of analysis to a focus on organization and consciousness. So part of the question that's at the forefront of my mind recently is what feels like an imperative to debiologize whiteness in our analysis and in our politics. Understanding white as a political color, not white as a biological category that's defined by race or inheritance. So what would it mean for us to think about white organization? Is there a distinct white organization? What are those forms of organization? What is a white consciousness? And what does that consciousness look like? How do we understand it and critique it? And maybe we could look to, for me, these are just very provisional notes, linking ideas of normativity with counter-revolutionary reaction, as Ahmad said, a permanent counter-revolution. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief thinking about this question about how my work encounters settler colonialism and colonization or racial capitalism. I think I've been thinking about this for a little, and I'm incredibly excited to be here with Manu and Alyosha. And in my head, I have Chandan Reddy and Jodi Malamed and Juliana Hupagis and a host of other people who have been really instrumental, I think, over the years of engaging and helping me put forward, Lisa, your work. I mean, there's so much that is, everything happens collaboratively and thinking with and through. I think transit was is a hard book for me to think about now, because at the time I wrote it, I was coming from post-colonial theory, and it was at a moment before we turned to settler colonialism as a way to talk about the United States. And it was written out of a frustration in those conversations that were coming from post-colonial studies about why the continent, why the United States, why Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. Well, the Caribbean gets brought in interesting ways. Why indigenous peoples were vacated as having any presence in the conversation. And so the way I tried to fix that was to spatialize slightly racialization and colonization, right? To pry them apart just slightly to help us get at the investments that were part of what we were calling at that point liberal multiculturalism. It's such a weird thing to bring into the world right now because we're here in the return of white supremacy. Well, it's not a return. The reveal of white supremacy that's been there all along, right? But at those moments, there was a certain way in which we were understanding the smooth curve of progress within the United States that assumed that the more we could incorporate people into the system, the more rights that were given, the more presence that was given, the more legibility, visibility, all of these things, that we would somehow end up in a better place, right? And as a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, I'm going to position myself historically, I think, just because it'll show some of the stakes of the work, right? My great-great-grand-uncle was governor of the Chickasaw Nation in the 1890s. He worked very hard as part of the pullback party to resist allotment. He was 3 months old at removal. He was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. He was removed, and our family went with over 130 slaves to Indian Territory. So his ability to be governor and be part of the ruling family was contingent upon black slavery. And this is a conversation that has not yet really fully been explored within the Chickasaw Nation as it's within its historical consequences. The Cherokee Nation occasionally has accountings with this, but it is a responsibility of an entanglement that is, I think, at the heart of how we get to the complexities of what colonialism and slavery wrought in homelands for us, right? So how do we hold racialization and colonization where Chickasaws are losing our lands, are racialized in that form, and are also functioning as sovereign nations that are participating in racialization and slavery, right? And then how do we think about what an indigenous responsibilities are in this, and then how we think about the complicities of everyone. I was at the time writing this, like it was in the early 2000s. Settler emerged in various conversations. Manu just traced a couple of genealogies for it. In post-colonial studies, there was a course work that was being done in Canada talking about, Margaret Atwood as a settler and post-colonial writer. There was, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, hosts of different ways that these questions were being framed that frankly always centered the white settler, right? Always centered the white settler. And so it was some frustration that I was trying to find a way to pry that apart, to sort of disaggregate whiteness with settlement in order to understand the United States potentially and the Caribbean as something slightly different, right? As having a different trajectory of that would account for U.S. imperialism that grew out of the colonization. And the United States can only do what it does because it dominates indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. It's an ongoing relationship. It's one that is never finished, and it's contingent, right? It depends upon us naturalizing the idea that there are 50 states, right? That these are borders that are absolutely secure. And that are not contingent upon treaties negotiated with every single community that makes this up. So, so there was that element. And then it was that the force of presence is not necessarily and primarily white settlers, right? And that's why I went and turned to Canoe Brathwaite. And it's thinking about him and his recent passing. And understanding the stakes of what he's brought to Indigenous studies, the scale of insights that he brought for us. Thinking about the category of arrivant, to have a possibility of a way of understanding forced removals as being brought into relationship to histories of colonialism, genocide, slavery. How do we actually understand and undo or even repair a colonial history that's built out of not an agentive settler who gets to take his sovereignty everywhere, as somebody like Lorenzo Veracini might say, but really actually through the work and labor of bodies that aren't even allowed to have agency of their own, right? And how do we then also imagine what justice could possibly be in that configuration, with everyone forced into violences and conscripted into a relationship that is counterproductive to survival for everyone, right? For the planet too. We're looking at these scales getting bigger and bigger. They always have been, but I think, as we are in our contemporary moment, we are seeing the planet's response to us and to the scales of what we're calling racial capitalism or colonial capitalism, or, I mean, there's many ways that we're trying to triangulate or I don't know, not even triangulate, come at it from multiple angles, that what it is that what we've produced. And so that was at least the starting point in this. I think I came to racial capitalism, interestingly, through getting to meet Jodi Byrd and having her say, I think it would be really amazing to see you read Cedric Robinson. And I was like, I was familiar with it, but she's like, I'd really love to see you sit down and actually talk to that through Indigenous studies. And in some ways that became the framework for economies of dispossession, taking up that wish to bring these things into conversation in a more sustained way. And so it was through Jodi, and it was through, Jodi's work that I'm starting to really appreciate how we can understand capitalism through its anti-relationalities and its anti-relational form as the actual mode of its relationship, right? She gets that through Ruthie Gilmore. And so in that conversation with her, with Chundan, thinking about his work in freedom with violence, just this kind of continual repetition of a frontier metaphor for this progressive incorporation of peoples in the horizons of both being oppressed and then liberated, right? This hothouse that maybe Marx might call it, of progression from savagery to civilization. That this entire system is giving us, a way to hold both capitalism as its anti-relational form, colonialism as its own relational form, and we can talk about how we might want to name that form, and then how we get to even a temporality within this. And as always, the concern for me is how indigenous peoples fall out of even the conversation around settler colonialism. It's almost one of the things that I'm still struggling with in my newest work is to think about why it is that there's a constant vacating of the urgency of indigeneity at every turn, no matter what is going on, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or it's Wet'suwet'en. There's always an argument as to why it's so small that it shouldn't matter in the scale of what everyone is facing in the world. So there's a minimization, a disappearance, a vanishing. Indigenous women particularly go missing and constantly disappeared in this. And so the challenge is always how to hold what Indigenous studies brings to the conversation of understanding capitalism, racialization, colonization, without either falling into disappearing them completely, or ending up doing some form of what Aiko Day might call romantic anti-capitalism, right? Yeah. There's so much more I want to say, but I also want to get to Alyosha, and then I want us to come back to thinking about all the questions that sort of extend from that. So maybe I'll pause here. Yeah.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you all, and I'm just so grateful to Lisa and Dan for the invitation, and to be likewise with some of my favorite people. So I'm going to be, I think, pretty short because I would like to kind of get to the broader discussion, but I just want to pick up on a couple of the themes that have come up so far, and I guess maybe put out for kind of further discussion, returning to this, thinking about this relationship between racial capitalism and settler colonialism within a broader framework of kind of the imperialism. To begin by saying a little bit about this notion of ongoing, right? Because one of the ways in which now discussions around settler colonialism are framed are with a kind of the phrase or the kind of trope of saying ongoing settler colonialism, which I think comes from an impulse, understandable. I think is something, my own impulse in terms of coming to some of the work that I've done to make the argument counter to this sort of historical conclusion, the notion of foundations, the notion of somehow a previous historical moment that has come and gone, that in fact colonialism is something that is ongoing. But I think there's a gap between this notion of ongoing and this sort of idea of foundations. There's something that actually is profoundly unsatisfying about that phrase and the way it circulates now. And I think that one of the reasons is because it doesn't actually contend with the historicity, the substantive materiality of what it means to be ongoing, right? It flattens. There's a notion that somehow we've now recognized that there's this thing called colonialism. It's, yes, this is not a moment in the United States past. This is only, I'm not saying everybody says this. I'm saying in certain kind of conversations, there's this is something we now acknowledge, and we, by this phrase, ongoing settler colonialism. And so I think that the problem, part of the problem and part of the way in which actually putting substantively in conversation this notion of racial capitalism and settler colonialism together in grappling with what that ongoing might mean is the kind of profound way in which both of these are formations that are historical, that mean specific things differently at different moments, and that come to mean something very specific in the present. And so one of the ways I think that it's possible to kind of get to those questions is through an analysis of social reproduction. And I think this goes to some of the things that have come up, maybe from a slightly different angle, gets to this question of what ongoing is. That if you think of the kind of the framework of social reproduction, you're forced to actually have to think about how are these relations reproduced right now? In what ways are the sort of dynamics of power, of subordination, of value being kind of staged? And in that staging, I mean, it goes to, I think, also something that's really important, which is the ongoing may also then do what some of the critiques, I think, that have been leveled at Patrick Wolf is to say, ongoing seems to imply an infiniteness. It basically reaffirms the settler claim to permanence. And so if you look at social reproduction instead as a way of thinking about what ongoing means, it actually means that it's hardly ongoing. It's not ongoing in any sort of permanent sense. It's always in flux. It's always open to contestation. It's, I mean, I think of Stuart Hall's, the ways of, there's no guarantee that things are put back together in the same way. And I think that's a profoundly important point, both in terms of thinking about contestation, about realizing that conditions that seem permanent are not, but it's also important to realize that in speaking about something which we might now recognize, hopefully we recognize, or we's a problematic formation there, but that the thing called the United States is not something that is self-evident. That is not something that is actually ongoing. It is something that is constantly being reproduced in its very heterogeneity in ways that, again, seek to naturalize, to take as given that formation. So I think that part of the way in thinking about capitalism as itself historically emerging alongside in concert with colonization, that historically, the forms of modern notions of modern race, racialization, that all of these coincide is not necessarily to provide, again, like what Manu was talking about, to presume that these things are explanatory mechanisms that we read forward, but instead to really see the way that these are a set of dynamics that are recreated and given meaning in specific ways at particular conjunctures. And so, so I would just say one more small thing before ending. So the book that I'm finishing right now tries to do some of the things that I just said by really framing the U.S. as this sort of predatory assembly. Which is to say, it is not something that pre-exists, nor does it exist in any coherent fashion other than the ways in which it naturalizes and normalizes itself as such. So that, and this goes in the introduction to the formations of the United States. Colonialism is a piece that they sort of open with talking about the sort of the heterogeneity just of the geopolitical sense of unincorporated territories, protectorates, the colonias, just all the sort of multiplicities that coexist, that somehow they're kind of spaces of native sovereignty that are still presumed to be subsumed, still presumed to be domestic dependent nations, that in fact that's already something that's presupposed, but in fact never accepted. That's, so to take that seriously and think about actually the kind of ongoing history that is a history of the United States as a nation state that can't be read from within the history of the United States, but has to be read from multiple vantage points to see the way in which it's produced through the active appropriation and subordination of peoples through things like slavery, through racialization, the various forms of devaluation, through the appropriation of land that is never final, that is always ongoing and contested. So I think that's one potential way, I hope, at least in the book, that I'm trying to get to things like what Jodi was talking about, like how you can talk about something like settler colonization in ways that don't just recenter white folks again, tell the story of the ways in which, as Manu mentioned, they're replenishing the earth. There's sort of these narratives of conquest that kind of have their own teleologies that always end up talking about white people again. Talking about colonizers. That, I think, is sort of part of the task, and I think actually thinking capitalism as a historical formation that rooted in particular forms of wage labor and land theft that coincide historically and work together but don't become the same thing, thinking these things together gives us a new way to ask new questions and also to actually I think, fundamentally see that our task, the notion of decolonization is another phrase that terms for everything's getting decolonized now. So I would say you can't decolonize in the United States. The abolition of the United States is decolonization. The United States can never be, you can't decolonize institutions that are themselves the effects and are reproduced through the processes of colonization and capitalist exploitation. It's only through their abolition that we get to something we might actually call decolonization.
That's wonderful. Well, we've just had 3 extraordinary comments on the relationship between settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and empire. And what strikes me is how all 3 of these very rich collaborative thinkers are very much committed to defamiliarizing terms and concepts and situating them in material and historical contexts, and also thinking in a relational way. So whether Manu's very rich comments about the ways in which settler colonialism as a form of white class collaboration can be traced not only in the settlement of the United States, but within U.S. imperialism, to Jodi's very moving statement about the continued and repetitive erasure of indigenous people and indigenous history, even as settler colonialism is recited. And Alyosha's work here and what he's just described and in his forthcoming book, but also in his writings, looking at the ways in which the U.S. colonial present is precisely this predatory assemblage of settlement, extraction, racial slavery, overseas empire, configured in different historical moments together. So I guess to open discussion, I wanted to just ask each of you to talk about this matter of configuration. I mean, I think Jodi was getting at this with your discussion of your family. The ways in which these things are not isolatable. The histories of indigenous people and the history of settler violence is not in a different temporal, or is configured with racial slavery in the history you're describing. The seizure of land and the building of the railroads is coterminous with the displacement and use of immigrant labor, and so forth. So I wonder if you could all talk about the difficulties of conceptualizing entanglement, relationality, and configuration, and the ramifications for struggling against this U.S. colonial present. Is there a way, for example, that rather than in the analysis of these forms of extraction, slavery, and empire, maybe it's in the counter struggles against it that we actually see ways of conceiving these, what Manu calls in Empire's Tracks, the differentiated unity of capitalism and empire. So do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I can just say something initially,
Yes.
which is, so I'm actually thinking a little bit, we had talked a bit about the notion of, I'm going to fold this into one of the other things
Yes.
we talked about, which is to say about the question of land acknowledgement.
Yes, why don't you talk about that?
Because, so
Didn't know how to ask.
we were speaking, we had a little discussion before about the way in which land acknowledgements operate these days. Yeah, sure. So, thank you. See, teamwork, it's all about collaboration. So, as we were talking about this, we went and looked to see, well, what does Yale do in these ways? And it's interesting to see that they do, in fact, have formal guidelines for providing land acknowledgements. Which they described as words of recognition and thanks, frequently open events found in our written events today. So they say that this is their provided paragraph that's a model. It says, Yale University acknowledges that indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chautauqua, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. So one of the things that we were, so this, in talking about like what a land acknowledgement might, the way in which this now circulates, because certainly in the United States, maybe different than Canada, there's been a kind of somewhat a turn to institutions like Yale and other universities, including land acknowledgements, having this now, what is now become, well, like in Canada, a largely perfunctory means to, especially included on official guidelines, that allows something like an acknowledgement of the past in order to foreclose this. It basically exonerates Yale, exonerates any, I mean, it's not specific to Yale, but, and so what we were talking about is like, what can you do with a land acknowledgement that would be different than that? One thing that came to my mind as we were having this conversation is, so when Lisa mentioned, or maybe Dan mentioned, the social text issue, we had a gathering here like a year and a half ago or something like that. Steve Pitti gave the most incredible opening remarks to that, and to me provided a model of what a land acknowledgement could be. Because what Steve did, I don't know if some folks may have been here, but was to not only to acknowledge the native peoples and land, and to also to in such a way that really seemed to convey this wasn't something about a past thing, that these are lands that, of course, now who knows where those people are, to acknowledge that as a living relationship, but also to go further and to make connections, and this is getting to the actual, this does have to do with the question that you just posed. So getting to the ways in which those relations are bound up with also how Yale plays a very specific role in New Haven, in this part of Connecticut, and the ways in which, talking about undocumented people in the context of this, everything, a struggle, you know, the forms of like racial terror that students, faculty experience in the context of university, again, not exceptional to Yale, but really the ways in which to draw out the specificity of place, I thought was a way to do a land acknowledgement that addressed how those in connection, how that sort of, the ways that there are connections that between peoples who are differently positioned, but nonetheless subjugated to the forms of colonization, capitalist extraction in ways that do ongoing intense violence. And by acknowledging the ways in which this place is structured by those conditions, provides ways that we can see connections between each other and struggle against those. So to me, that was just such a, I would say thank you again, Steve, for that, because it was such a model of how, and again, can be just a moment in continuing to think about what a land acknowledgement can be, because also land acknowledgements, right, should actually be a gesture towards how do you then return land, how do you undo these conditions, right? They're not just, land acknowledgements now function most often as a way to secure property, not to redistribute it. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think along those lines, like think about capaciously what a land acknowledgement is. Land acknowledgement should not, I think, actually shouldn't just be about Native peoples. It should be about Native peoples as living, having specific relationships to the land that we are, wherever we are, but also bound up with other peoples and other forms of structures of power and dispossession. So that's part of the answer to your question.
In a way that those versions of land acknowledgement with the respect and honor, which resonates unfortunately with the language around the mascot at the University of Illinois, which they respect and honor Indians with. I think thinking about what a land acknowledgement should be is an accounting to responsibility of what to do in relationship to, you know, imagining that abolition as an actual form of decolonization. I appreciated that, right? You cannot have the United States as a decolonial structure. It cannot exist in that form. It won't. And here's where decolonization for indigenous peoples, it requires a transformation of our government structures that have invested in certain versions of sovereignty, anti-blackness, capitalism, militarism. We are smack in the middle of U.S. empire in those forms, and thinking about other alternatives, which is, I think, partly why we see in Indigenous studies a turn towards this notion of relationality, right? That is an actual governance structure. It's a mode of being in relationship. It's a mode of being related to people and land and water and non-human and all its forms. But it's about alternatives to racial capitalism, to imperial sovereignty, to extraction, and to profit. So.
I think in your remarks, Jodi, I just wrote a note here, treaty versus constitution. You raised the treaty, and it's something I've been thinking about. If we take Indigenous studies not as, indigeneity in Indigenous studies not as an ontological category, but as a category of organization, political organization, a social organization, or consciousness, one of the things I think it puts on the table, that move, is to see a treaty as the founding document or genre of document of collective life rather than a constitution. And what then does that open up for us to even rethink other historical moments? So this is also partly to think, again, it's an attempt to answer what you put on the table, like Black Reconstruction. What if we read Black Reconstruction through the lens of treaties? What's going on with treaty relationships in Black Reconstruction and the brief moment of a possibility of the abolition of slavery, brief moment when the slave stands in the sun. What if we understand that historical moment through a lens of treaty relationships rather than through the lens of constitution and reforming or abolishing or throwing out a constitution? So, what if a land acknowledgement was to draw on something, a slogan that has a long history on this continent, honor the treaties? That's a very different kind of approach to take.
Great. Well, I'm aware that it's 5, so I think we would like to open it up rather than me asking you questions. Maybe people would like to ask questions yourselves. I know you had a discussion in Dan's seminar. If there's some of you who want to continue some of those questions, please address them to our speakers now. Well, while you're thinking of them, okay. I have lots of questions.
I have 2 questions. What about this revitalizing of race? How we biology and race, and how race is kind of between this social construction and this biological reality. I think about how in women's rights there is always this question of what is nature and what is culture, and so how can we navigate between these 2 lines? And my other question would be, I come from an international law background, and for me with the question of indigenous people, something I just can't understand is how they had the sovereignty to sign treaties, but they don't have sovereignty in the international realm today. So how was it that at some point, to be sure that they were dominated, they had the right to sign treaties, and now they can't claim this right to be recognized as autonomous people or nations?
I'll start with that last one first in a way, because a lot of Native nations have actually tried to enter into international, to evoke international sovereignty, either with each other, which is one thing that activists and scholars in the field have called for, like to say we can step outside of the recognition that states are giving us to recognize ourselves, that this is the most profound version, that our sovereignty never was diminished, it can't be taken, it can't be given, it's inherent to what we are as peoples, right? But then there's the other side of this, which is back to the United States. Is what, and here I find Manu's notion of counter-sovereignty incredibly useful, because part of that counter-sovereignty of the United States enacting its own sovereignty was through the Marshall Trilogies that declared American Indian nations to be domestic dependent. That was an act to absolutely prevent foreign nations from having any ability to make alliances with indigenous nations at a moment the United States is trying to build itself as it started its empire. Yeah. So I mean, it's very calculated, that move to somehow suggest that indigenous peoples in North America are not part of an international nation, when an international community, when in fact we actually were, and had treaties. I mean, Chickasaws had treaties with the French, the Spanish, the British, the Americans, some of them existing all at the same time. That's a history that we lose and forget when we start to sort of pull into a United States formation.
Well, and I would just add that that's a project that there's not just the Marshall Trilogy, but a series of markers throughout the 19th century, whether it's the establishment of the reservation system in 1851, or especially with the Indian Appropriations Act in 1871, where the U.S. unilaterally says we will no longer enter into treaties with Native nations. That there's a series of moves that deliberately seek to diminish and to naturalize the diminution of Native sovereignty as something different and less than under the auspice of the United States. The entire 19th century is a kind of series of moves towards that that Native nations never accepted. I mean, so you have the Iroquois Tasake going to in the League of Nations in 1924, along with other people on behalf of their own nations, lobbying this international forum. This continues to happen up into the present. I'm working on a piece now where a series of nations, including the Quinault and the Standing Rock tribe and the Tlingit and Haida, basically, at the moment that Trump withdraws from the Paris Accord, or they put together a joint statement saying, because the U.S. fails in its obligation to the world and is withdrawing from it, we as sovereign nations make a declaration that we will step up to this challenge, and we expect that the United Nations will also solicit and encourage other indigenous nations to directly have relations with the UN in the face of climate catastrophe. So this is an ongoing. So your question, in a certain way, it's a great question, because it's something that has been naturalized through very specific work historically to make it somehow self-evident, when in fact that's what the work of U.S. empire is. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll say something briefly also about internationalism too.
Yeah.
I mean, not only it's a how do we define what a nation is? I think that's one of the questions raised here. If you go to the UN General Assembly, these are nation states, but why are they? Indigenous organizations can attend General Assembly meetings as special interest groups alongside environmentalists, corporations, and other organizations. So why not as members of the General Assembly? And what would that look like? So on the question of debiologization, I really thank you for the question. I've been reading the work of Elizabeth Armstrong a lot, and she poses this question for North American feminism, where there was a turn to a focus on the subject and asking the question, who is the subject of feminism, and how is that subject identified? And that was also a turn away from a focus on questions of organization, which had existed in North American feminist politics and thought beforehand. So there's been a turn towards questions of the subject, which I think, let's say in a conversation on settler colonialism, could be like a turn towards an emphasis on questions of who is a settler, who is a native, and a turn away from questions of organization. Maybe a question from indigenous studies that have been live for a long time, what's a treaty and what is a treaty relationship put in place? So when I think about debiologizing race, it's about, again, like re-emphasizing organization, re-emphasizing consciousness, rather than emphasizing this question of the subject.
Do you want to do the questions?
Thank you all so much for all your work and everything you shared with us today. I was just curious, you touched a little bit on this, mentioning like Braithwaite's ideas about the environment and about land acknowledgements that more broadly speak to relationships of power and relationships to the land. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, in each of your work, about just like the state of being a racialized settler and what responsibilities, complicities, entanglements that produces, and like how you approach those in your work.
That's a great question. Thanks. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about it because like there's a part of me that there is strands of settler colonial studies and indigenous studies that are trying to think about racialized settlers or settlers of color or Asian settlers. There's lots of different ways that this question is being approached from various places in Hawaii, from Canada, from the U.S. I think in my work I wanted to push against that tendency just a bit because I wanted to hold through the category of arrivant, the fact that there isn't. I think there's a way in which settler of color or racialized settlers assumes a kind of participation within settler colonialism that isn't necessarily always a choice and isn't always. It's not equivalent to settler, so it ends up using whiteness as a frame to hold everything, right? And so I wanted to use brathwaite to understand the Middle Passage as a particular way of understanding both the violence of that that movement, that forced movement across the Atlantic, right? As a way to also have a possibility of an other kind of relationship with the new space that we're in. If you're always in a constant mode of arrival, right? And I think here's where it's interesting because indigenous peoples never get to arrive, and we never get to arrive. This is partly why we never are really present, right? We never get to arrive into the present or even the future, which is why you see a lot of indigenous studies pushing towards futurisms because of the temporal stack against us, right? And so I think I appreciate those who want to take accountability and call for understanding how structures, here's where Patrick Wolf's framework is useful in that he acknowledges that settler colonialism is a structure, right? Which means that people can be in it in certain ways. But I also want to really, for me, be careful about assuming that structure is a self-identity, or that people identify in it as settler of color or arrivant. These to me aren't identificatory, right? They're relationships still, and there's still ways that can be transformed towards other kinds of relationships that are more resistant to what whiteness and white settler settlement can allow us. Yeah.
Alyosha and Juliana Hupagis and I collaborated on a special issue of Theory and Event where we were trying to theorize this idea of colonial unknowing. And what actually sparked that was an engagement with transitive empire. And there were several different through lines, a lot of different through lines that led us to that set of conversations that congealed around this idea of colonial unknowing. And one was, it's still really bizarre to me that transitive empire is not read as a queer text. As a queer reading practice, so that these categories of settler and arrivant and native are actually points of critique, and they're not subject positions, right? And they name, normative power dimensions, these seductions of power at play, seductions of power of like sovereignty or ownership, that are seductions that will be, foreclosed and ripped away from us. And so I think part of this impulse to read across relations and to read across fields was driven by that particular reading of Transitive Empire as a text.
And just to kind of echo a little bit of what has already been said so well, that I think like the set of debates around settler of color misconstrues the dynamics of power, right? I mean, it's a way to sort of create these equivalencies that actually don't reckon with what exactly Manu and Jodi have just said. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's where your question's coming from. I think your question really is, is an excellent one to speak to. What are these relationships? And I think that so often, though, the response has been like a misreading of Jodi's work to say somehow she has this tripart schema and somehow that like these are identity categories, when in fact that's not what the work does, as both Manu and Jodi have just said. So, but the constant reinscription of that, I think, tells us a lot, right? I mean, there's a real impulse to turn to those as identity categories, and I mean, I can't help but think some of those is a kind of white supremacist logic. I mean, I think that there's also like the identity to talk about an identity as settler is bizarre to me, right? For white folks too, like, is it a claiming as in like, is it an apology? Is it a kind of an affirmation? Is it, as opposed to reckoning with the kind of the histories of which we're complicit and we're differently positioned? It's just so much more than that tripartite schema. But I do think, as I said already, I think there's a reason why it keeps recirculating as just that, as these fixed points.
I think that, I mean, just to think about that, we were talking beforehand about the ontological turn that we're in, and thinking about how a lot of our arguments are hinged upon how we are understanding ourselves, and then how we position ourselves. And so there is this identificatory impulse, right, to locate oneself within power, privilege, that come from, I think, really sometimes incredibly important intellectual traditions from Black feminism to really locate identity politics, intersectionality, and as a space to speak from, right? But it ends up in this moment as we're watching the radical right, reassert its dominance. We're seeing the other side of it, which is a narcissistic celebration of power. And so I find myself being uncomfortable with that ontological turn, right? I said to the class before this that there's parts of me, this is where I'm a post-colonialist. I keep holding Gayatri Spivak's caution about always being the informant, right? That this is it's set up for us. It's the expectation to always be the person speaking, but the trap of that is her point, which is this: when you're speaking, you're no longer subaltern. Right, you are already encoded into power. That's actually the trick of the subaltern speaking or not speaking, right?
Absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much. So I have given Jodi what you had said earlier, a question about like futures and futurity. So the logic of abolition implies a kind of futurity, the decolonial implies a kind of futurity. And social reproduction as a logic of settler colonialism and racial capitalism also implies futurity. So I wonder for like each of your work, how are you thinking, like given your frames about the intersections of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, how are you thinking about futurity? And like that can include, its limits, your critiques of futurity, or the sort of like pull towards, that kind of historical or temporal orientation. And I guess I also have a question of, given what Manu said about the conjectural nature of empire, how do we work that logic of the sort of conjectural towards a future? Because I think for historical materialism, that follows very easily, but it seems a little bit trickier, or potentially trickier, but really interesting to try to work that logic projected forward in time.
Well, for me, the way I understand conjunctural analysis is precisely to analyze what are the points of contradiction in the present and what are the possible futures. So there's always a possibility in a crisis like we're living in for capital or the imperialist or the colonizer to retrench their power and strengthen their power. And that's a strong likelihood. But there's also the possibility for an opening in another direction. So to me, that's precisely the power of conjunctural analysis or historical materialism. It's a methodology that actually puts the possibility of a different future on the table. So, if I'm working in the 19th century in archives, the questions I'm asking of that archive just for me personally, are driven by my assessment of what's happening in the world as I go to that archive, what's going on outside, as I'm reading these documents from 1865. The questions I would ask of it, yeah.
If I could just add, in your introduction to formations of U.S. colonialism, Alyosha, you describe U.S. colonialism as continuously failing and perpetually incomplete. And I wonder, picking up on this idea of dialectical materialism, to what extent that converges with a Marxist idea of contradiction. Or what difference does it make that it's incomplete and contradictory? You don't use that word, contradictory. I'm imposing that.
Yeah, I mean, that just switched. Okay, so I hadn't thought about thinking of those two things together. I think it makes a lot of sense in some ways, because it's about sort of beginning kind of an imminent critique of something that's taken to be self-evident. Mm-hmm. I guess I could see the sort of that Marxist critique is one that is structured around basically how do you understand and amplify those contradictions, right? That's one of the things that critical theory does. And so I could see those things working together very well in the sense of like understanding this geopolitical entity called the United States that's taken to be self-evident, that's taken to have a kind of a solidity and a coherence, that when we in fact begin to see the constituent parts as in fact not all lining up, that begins to open up possibilities. I mean, I guess when in thinking about that framing in the introduction, my thought really had to do was almost more descriptive, right? Like that if we actually look at the very conditions that we imagine to be one way, they are not that. Mm-hmm. And that not being that opens up possibilities for future in the sense that if we realize that actually the thing that we take to be self-evident, permanent, whatever, we use the term defamiliarization at the beginning. I think maybe there's a connection there with the Marxist critique around contradictions. It seems to me I don't know, when I think about teaching, when I think about writing, one of the fundamental things I think that we do is that we draw attention to those things that we seem to understand and say, this isn't what it is that you thought it was all along. It's that kind of defamiliarization that allows a kind of few projects of futurity, of transformation, of liberation, revolution, right? Because actually the things that seem to be so powerful as they are, the common sense that we take to be kind of monolithic and unalterable is not that. And by beginning to see that, we actually have the possibility to intervene in new ways.
I think maybe also it displaces the sense of Marxist contradiction as only being between capital and labor, that there are actually different sites of contradiction if you're looking at settler colonialism, racial slavery, overseas empire, and that's part of the perpetual incompleteness I was understanding.
Well, and I think that, when you were asking the question, which was a wonderful question, I think what I was thinking about in terms of futurity is the sort of the radical imagination of futurisms, right? Mm-hmm. So like, whether it's, Afrofuturism, indigenous, there's multiple futurisms now that I think are about this possibility of what kind of radical imagination can we have in a context where we're told again and again that if anything, there is no future, right? Mm-hmm. The world, we're in the death throes of the world that we inhabit. That a radical imagination is more crucial, more now than ever. It may not, it may not be the kind of ultimate set of possibilities, but actually I think it's like not being, if we can have a radical imagination that's grounded in an understanding of present conditions, maybe that's a conjunctural analysis again, then that's where we get somewhere different. Mm-hmm. And so much of power is shorn up by making sure that we don't see that.
I'll just say I have at various moments in my next book on video games, toyed with the idea of indigenous pessimisms as a way to think about indigenous futurisms, right? Because there's something that's happening within how indigenous peoples are both dealing with the reality of, I mean, here's where the ongoing is. It does certain work to actually make it present, right? I mean, I appreciate all the ways you unravel, but one of the things that, I think indigenous futurists are saying is that we're living, in Lindsay Nixon's words, apocalypse now, right? That we've already gone through the disaster, and through that's what genocide and colonialism were, right? And that we've already survived that. And so, but it's interesting that in the literatures that we're producing, the films, it's even more dystopic, and yet it's always speaking to survival and dystopia. Right? There's a certain, this is where indigenous pessimism gets, and I want intentionally to be in conversation with Afro-pessimism, right? In this, and in part because I think there's a critical difference around indigeneity in the dialectic with whiteness. Whiteness constantly puts itself into the space of indigeneity in settlement, and so it prevents the kind of negation that Afro-pessimism is able to sort of activate, because it's already a negation of a negation, because it's only where whiteness wants to be. It wants to be the native. It's constantly filling that up in that space. That's the whole. So indigenous imaginings of the future have to be able to account for that and not replicate anti-blackness in that process.
Hi. Thank you for that presentations. They were all very wonderful, and I learned a lot. For me, one of the things that was so refreshing about so much what you were saying is your engagement, or what I see that has historically been sort of a separation between what we now consider Native or Indigenous studies and blacks and sort of Black studies, or even the Black radical tradition. And so, especially in terms of specifically when we're thinking about racial capitalism and cellular colonialism as different frameworks, but what this reminded me too is even thinking about how these two terms and the intellectual endeavor we're doing right now are themselves historical products. So thinking of racial capitalism precedes Robinson and actually South Africa, right? And
yes.
The ways they were thinking about the apartheid state, which was obviously racial capitalist.
Yes.
But so what I find amazing is that there's also this historical trajectory of that term, all the way from somewhere where we think, oh, it's far, to today, which is helping us explain this sort of new global order. So I just want to say that comment because I think it's one of the first few times I felt this sort of connection between the scholarship, but also just the historical events that are happening. And I just want to say I really appreciate that. So yeah, I don't have a question, but
Actually, so I was going to respond to your non-question with a non-answer, which is I think that sort of also the genealogy that you just spoke to in terms of racial capitalism being within the South African context, within our apartheid South Africa. I feel like in general, so there's a way in which attending to the specificity of like the here and now is crucial, but I also think that here and now there's such a impulse, a kind of set of, I think that we oftentimes, it's being located in the U.S., if we're talking about sort of like, even for Native folks in North America, how different that is than other contexts. So like to talk about African indigeneities, to talk about, what it looks like across the hemisphere. I think that's so crucial. It needs to be part of the conversation as well. And I just to gesture to that, when you were saying that made me think about how important it is as located here to make these broader set of connections, which are fraught. I mean, they're not simple like transpositions of something like indigeneity is a framework that also is enmeshed with colonialism. But anyway, I thank you for that comment, and that was my follow-up comment.
I think also that attentiveness, the work actually can help us defamiliarize the present, and that's part of what the work is about. By really, and that puts futurity on the table in a different way. The present isn't natural; it's not naturally ordained. The present is one particular possible present among other presents, possible presents. So that's, to me, that's like puts futurity on the table. But to raise South Africa, it also then raises the questions, how can we see these in different ways? It's significant that the conversation on cellular colonialism emerges out of the South African Communist Party in the struggle against apartheid? What is it that SACP and the leadership, the intellectual leadership of the party, was seeing with apartheid South Africa and naming something as settler colonialism that then could be useful for us? Let's say if we want to read the work of someone like Gerald Horne, who wants us to understand the history of this continent through the lens of class collaboration. Again, and then what does that put on the table for us with seeing futurity in a different way?
So we're at 5:30, and this has been such a rich discussion. I was just thinking a panel on settler colonialism and racial capitalism would not necessarily inspire us to think about possibility, hope, what's available to us, the work we have to do. And yet that's precisely what you've given us, a sense of all the work that we can do to imagine a whole set of different futures. So we're really grateful for everything you've shared, the way you've modeled collaboration for us, to RATM again for the resources to bring it here, and for your great questions. Thank you so much again.